Imagine a sunny afternoon so ordinary, so safe, that you'd never think to lock your front door. Kids play in sprinklers on the lawn, neighbors chat from shaded porches, and the world feels gentle. 4 3-year-old Lori Poland, August 22nd, 1983, began just like that. But in less than 60 seconds, that gentle world shattered. A stranger in an orange car pulled up to the curb. With a simple offer of candy, he coaxed her inside, and then she was gone. Vanished in broad daylight, in front of witnesses. For 3 agonizing days, a state held its breath, fearing the worst. And then, a miracle. A wrong turn by a couple out birdwatching led to a voice crying out from a 15-foot deep sewage pit. "Mommy, I want some Kool-Aid." This is where most survivor stories end. But for Lori Poland, the rescue was just the beginning of a 40-year battle. A battle against a predator, against a justice system that failed her spectacularly, and against the trauma she was never meant to survive. This isn't just a cold case. This is the story of how one little girl's hell became her purpose, and how the system's greatest failure sparked a lifetime of fierce, unbreakable advocacy. If you're ready for a story that will challenge everything you think about survival, justice, and healing, you're in the right place. Make sure you're subscribed to Cold Case Desk and hit that like button. It truly helps us bring you more deep dive investigations like this one. Now, let's get into the chapters. The heat that Monday in late August was a tangible thing. A heavy blanket settled over the working-class neighborhood on West Bear Creek Drive in Sheridan, Colorado. It was the kind of day that defined childhood summers in the early 80s. The smell of cut grass, the rhythmic hiss of sprinklers painting rainbows on parched lawns, the sound of screen doors slapping shut as kids ran free. This was a place, and a time, where safety was assumed. Doors stayed unlocked. Parents watched from porches, not with anxiety, but with a casual, communal trust. In the small brick house at the center of this ordinary scene, 3-year-old Lori Poland finished lunch with her father. With her gap-toothed smile and blonde hair, she was the picture of innocent, sun-kissed youth, utterly unaware that the clock was already ticking on the childhood she knew. The sequence of events that followed was so brutally simple, so devastating in its ordinary setting, that it would forever haunt everyone who witnessed it. Lori went outside to join her brother and other children in the front yard. Neighbors were present. Workers from a business across the street sat in their cars during lunch breaks, enjoying the shade. Among them was a painter named Marvin Edler, eating his sandwich in his pickup truck, idly observing the neighborhood play. The scene was a postcard of American suburban normalcy. And then, the intrusion. An older, faded orange Datsun sedan pulled up to the curb. The car itself wasn't remarkable for the era, but its sudden, purposeless presence was a dissonant note in the harmonious afternoon. Inside was 21-year-old Robert Paul Thefault, a stranger with no connection to the Polands, a man with a history that would later snap into a terrifying pattern for investigators. He was not lost. He was hunting. His tactic was prehistoric in its deception. He coaxed Lori over. Did she like candy? What 3-year-old, especially in 1983, would say no? The transaction was monstrous in its simplicity. In seconds, persuaded to remove her pants, which were later found neatly folded on the curb, the little girl voluntarily climbed into the car, believing in the basic promise of a sweet treat. The orange Datsun drove away. It happened in full view of multiple witnesses, both children and adults, but it happened with such swift, brazen normality that intervention was impossible. The violence was in the abrupt departure, in the empty space where a child had just been. The aftermath was a burst of chaotic noise, children screaming, running into houses, a father emerging with popsicles only to find his daughter gone, her tricycle lying on its side in the grass, one wheel spinning slowly to a stop in the sweltering sun. The investigation that launched in those first frantic minutes was a testament to both pre-digital diligence and community cohesion. There was no Amber Alert, no cell phones, no national crime databases instantly accessible. Instead, there were human beings talking to each other. Witnesses provided astonishingly clear details: the make, model, and distinctive faded color of the car, the black vinyl top, the letters on the door. Most crucially, they caught a partial license plate, ADV2. Sergeant Louis Flores of the Sheridan Police Department made a critical, forward-thinking decision. He sought permission to go directly to the media. Within hours, Lori's face and the description of that orange Datsun were on local news broadcasts. By evening, her parents, Diane and Richard, were on television, their faces etched with a raw, desperate grief that would galvanize an entire community. "She's my baby," Diane cried into the camera, a plea that would echo through living rooms across Colorado. Meanwhile, the mechanical wheels of investigation turned with remarkable speed. That partial plate, ADV 2, was run through motor vehicle records. It matched a registration, ADV 627, for a 1972 orange-brown Datsun, registered to Robert Paul Thefault in Denver. The connection was electrifying. Even more damning, the same partial plate had been linked to another recent attempted kidnapping report. The stranger had a pattern. By the very next day, August 23rd, police had a name, an address, and a vehicle description that matched perfectly. They descended on Thefault's Denver residence. And there it sat, in the driveway, as if daring them. The orange-brown Datsun, license plate ADV 627. The man who answered the door denied everything. He claimed he was home. He agreed to a polygraph. He was, for the moment, released, holding a sports coat over his head to hide from news photographers, an image of evasion that would become symbolic. But the net was closing. Police began 24-hour surveillance. They towed his car for forensic analysis, with his written consent. As technicians scoured the vehicle for evidence, a parallel operation of a different scale was underway. Hundreds of volunteers fanned out across the Denver area, searching parks, fields, and alleys. The community was looking for a little girl. But with each passing hour, as the search moved into its third day, the unspoken fear grew heavier. They were no longer looking for a child. They were looking for a body. The vanishing hour had stretched into an endless, suffocating wait, and hope was becoming a scarce commodity under the relentless Colorado sun. By the morning of Thursday, August 25th, the collective hope that had fueled the massive search for Lori Poland was fraying into a grim, resigned dread. 3.5 days had passed since the blonde-haired girl had vanished from her front yard. In the world of missing children, especially in 1983, that length of time rarely led to a happy ending. The volunteers kept searching, the police followed their leads, but a heavy sense of tragedy had begun to settle over the effort. The focus was shifting, almost imperceptibly, from rescue to recovery. It was within this gathering shadow that a couple from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, found themselves utterly lost. Stephen and Cynthia Gant were in Colorado on a birdwatching trip, a peaceful vacation that had led them to the remote, wooded expanses of Genesee Park near the Chief Jose exit. They were outsiders, unaware of the statewide anguish gripping the community just miles away, their minds on sparrows and vistas, not missing children. A wrong turn brought them down a quiet campground road, past a simple, rustic outhouse facility. Stephen initially drove right by it. It was an unremarkable structure in a remote area, the kind you wouldn't give a second glance. But Cynthia insisted they turn back. She needed to use the bathroom. It was a mundane, human decision, born of simple necessity, that would irrevocably alter the course of 2 lives. The outhouse was a basic pit toilet, a dark hole descending 12 to 15 feet into the ground. As Cynthia Gant used the facility, a strange sound drifted up from that abyss. It wasn't an animal. It was crying. Then, words formed in the darkness, a phrase so childlike, so heartbreakingly ordinary, that it seemed to shatter the very laws of reality in that grim, secluded place. "Mommy, I want some Kool-Aid." Stunned, the Gants called for help from a nearby phone booth at the Chief Jose campground. The call that went out to the Highland Rescue Squad was one of bewildered urgency, a report of a voice from an outhouse pit, a possibility too miraculous to believe yet too specific to ignore. Volunteer firefighter Steve Becker and Joanne Greenberg of the Genesee Fire Rescue were among those who responded. They arrived at a scene that defied all standard rescue protocols. The opening was small, the pit deep and filled with untreated sewage and toxic methane gases. This was not a place for life. It was a place of waste and decay, a tomb. Becker made the decision to go down on a harness, lowering himself into the unimaginable darkness, not knowing what, or who, he would find. What his flashlight revealed in that foul pit would stay with him for the rest of his life. There, standing in the muck, shivering violently, was a small figure wearing only her underwear. It was Lori Poland. Her skin was discolored, her legs and feet grotesquely swollen and infected from days of exposure to the corrosive waste and the cold. She was disoriented, hypothermic, and poisoned by fumes, yet she was impossibly, miraculously alive. Becker later recalled the visceral moment of contact. She was just looking for something warm to hold on to. As soon as I touched her, she grabbed me and held on until I pulled her out. That desperate, trusting clutch, the instinct of a child to cling to salvation, would become the defining image of the rescue. Lori herself would remember that anchor point, the word hold on, becoming synonymous with survival. The rescuers were unequivocal. There was no way she could have climbed out. Whoever had put her in that hole had not expected her to be found. This was not a hiding place. It was a deliberate disposal site, a 15-foot-deep grave. The ambulance ride to St. Anthony's Central Hospital was a race against the cascading physical trauma her small body had endured. Doctors faced a nightmare of complications: severe systemic infection from the contaminated wounds, the threat of gangrene, circulatory crisis from the prolonged exposure and swelling, and poisoning from hydrogen sulfide and methane. The initial medical fear was stark and terrible. They might have to amputate her legs to save her life. The injuries spoke of a brutal fall, followed by 3 days and 3 nights of fighting to stay alive in a cold, dark, chemical stew. Yet, as she had in the pit, Lori defied expectations. Her physical resilience mirrored a fierce, innate will that the predator had failed to extinguish. Her condition stabilized, then improved. By the very next day, Friday, August 26th, doctors were cautiously upgrading her prognosis from fair to good. They would call her recovery from the brink of physical catastrophe miraculous. Within days, she was well enough to be released, the hospital announcing it would absorb all costs, a small gesture of compassion in the face of such monstrousness. The public reunion, broadcast on television to a nation that had been holding its breath, was a torrent of raw emotion. The footage showed Lori, small and wrapped in blankets, being embraced by her weeping parents. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy, a rare victory in the often hopeless landscape of child abductions. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. The hospital was flooded with gifts, including over 20 giant stuffed animals. Companies offered the Poland family an all-expenses-paid trip to Disneyland. For a brief, shining moment, the story was one of incredible luck and human kindness, a feel-good headline about a community rallying around a survivor. Lori, in her hospital bed, was seen smiling, singing jingle bells, appearing to be the resilient child bouncing back. But the trauma, as it always does, leaked through the cracks of the celebratory narrative. That first night in the hospital, Lori was gripped by a nightmare, screaming, "Get me out of here! Get me out of here!" A flashback to the pit so visceral it terrorized her in the safety of her mother's arms. Child psychologist Dr. Richard Krugman from the renowned Kemp Center was brought in to begin the long, difficult work of helping a 3-year-old process the incomprehensible. This professional relationship would blossom into a lifelong bond and, decades later, a powerful partnership. The nation might have seen a miracle and moved on, but for Lori and her family, the real work was just beginning. The celebration of the rescue was vital, a necessary balm, but it also created a narrative of closure that was dangerously false. She was saved, yes, but she was not healed. And the legal system, now armed with a living victim and an identified suspect, was gearing up for a battle that would prove the rescue was not the end of the ordeal, but merely the end of its first, most dramatic act. The little girl who had been pulled from the darkness was now expected to perform another impossible task: to stand, in her own way, against the man who put her there. With Lori physically stabilized, the machinery of justice now required something extraordinary from its most vulnerable witness. The evidence was mounting: the car, the license plate match, the tire tracks near the remote outhouse. But to secure a conviction, prosecutors needed more than circumstantial links. They needed a positive identification of the predator by the victim. The problem, and the profound weight of the request, lay in the victim's age. Lori Poland was 3 years old. In 1983, the legal system viewed child witnesses with deep skepticism, often dismissing their accounts as fantasy, coercion, or the product of immature, unreliable memory. The entire case threatened to hinge on a question many believed unanswerable: Could a toddler truly deliver credible testimony? Sheridan Police Chief Joe Stevenson and a detective entered the hospital room not with demands, but with a careful, solemn duty. They carried with them a photo lineup, a standard police tool that, in this context, felt anything but standard. Among the pictures of various men, a fellow officer, a reserve deputy, a janitor, even Chief Stevenson himself, was the booking photo of Robert Paul Thiefault. The procedure had to be pristine, free of any hint of suggestion. There could be no pointing, no leading questions. The child had to choose, spontaneously and clearly, or the identification might be tossed out before trial even began. What happened in that room transcended legal procedure and entered the realm of the undeniable. When Chief Stevenson handed the array of photos to the little girl, she looked through them with a focus that belied her years. Then, her entire demeanor changed. Her face clouded. Her body language shifted from passive to agitated. She pointed directly at Thiefault's photo. "Oh, there he is," she said, with a chilling clarity. "That one. He did it. He put me in the hole." In his official report, Chief Stevenson would later write that it was his opinion, without doubt, that Lori Poland had identified her kidnapper. This wasn't a hesitant guess or a confused selection. It was a declaration of factual recognition, delivered with the unvarnished honesty of a child who has not yet learned to dissemble. Dr. Richard Krugman, the child psychologist who reviewed the videotaped interview, concurred utterly. He described her as rock solid. Her recoil, the fear that flashed in her eyes upon seeing the face, the way she sought comfort from her mother while maintaining the identification, these were not coached responses. They were the authentic, traumatic reactions of a victim confronting her attacker. This initial identification was only the beginning. In a subsequent 45-minute interview, Lori did something even more remarkable. Using dolls and simple language, she played out the sequence of events. The orange car, the offer of candy, the ride, the terrifying fall into the darkness. She consistently identified Thiefault, not only in the photo lineup, but also in a later police video lineup. Her narrative, though filtered through the limited vocabulary of a preschooler, was consistent and hauntingly specific. It wove together the known facts of the case with the private terror only she had experienced. Her testimony became the emotional and factual cornerstone of the prosecution's case. It gave voice to the forensic evidence, transforming hair samples and tire casts from abstract clues into supporting actors in a story she was narrating. For the police and the district attorney, this was a gift of immense power. A victim who could not only point a finger, but could also describe the crime with unwavering conviction. While Lori provided this critical testimony from her hospital bed, the physical evidence against Thiefault was being methodically compiled. The search of his Datsun, conducted with his written consent, yielded a crucial piece of forensic evidence: hair samples. Forensic analysis, though less sophisticated than today's DNA testing, concluded that these hairs were consistent with Lori Poland's hair. This scientific link placed her inside his vehicle, corroborating her story of being taken in the orange car. Furthermore, tire track casts made at the isolated outhouse site offered another tangible connection, suggesting his car had been at the location of her abandonment. Combined with the multiple eyewitness descriptions of the car and driver from the abduction scene and the damning license plate match, the case was constructing a formidable wall of evidence. It was a wall with two primary pillars: the cold, objective facts of forensic science and tire tracks, and the warm, subjective but unshakable certainty of a child's memory and recognition. On September 5, 1983, just 2 weeks after the miraculous rescue and bolstered by this evidence, Robert Paul Thiefault surrendered to police. He was booked into the Arapahoe County Jail on a bond set at $250,000, a sum reflecting the severity of the charges. A week later, the formal charges were filed, painting a stark picture of the alleged crimes: attempted first-degree murder, 2 counts of second-degree kidnapping, child abuse, and sexual assault on a child. The potential sentence totaled 48 years in prison. For the Poland family and a watching public, it seemed the system was working. The monster had been caught, identified by the victim, linked by science, and was facing the full weight of the law. The narrative felt righteous and clear, a story of evil confronted by resilience and good police work. The upcoming trial was perceived not as a risk, but as a formality, the final act where justice would be seen to be done. This public confidence, however, existed in a bubble outside the intricate and often frustrating realities of the criminal justice system. While the evidence appeared overwhelming on paper, it now had to run a gauntlet of legal challenges, procedural rules, and judicial interpretations. Default's court-appointed public defenders, Craig Truman and Pat Vance, were not about to concede the case. They began filing a barrage of pretrial motions, more than 30 in total, challenging every conceivable aspect of the prosecution's evidence. Their strategy was not to prove innocence, but to dismantle the state's ability to prove guilt. They attacked the legality of the searches, the admissibility of Lori's identification, the use of her interview tapes, and even whether Default had been properly advised of his Miranda rights. The case was no longer about what happened on August 22nd. It was becoming a complex battle over rules, precedents, and what a jury would be allowed to hear. The battlefield for this legal war was the courtroom of Judge Charles Friedman in Littleton District Court. Over 8 days of suppression hearings, the defense's arguments were heard. Judge Friedman faced critical decisions that would shape the trial's landscape. And in a series of rulings, he began to dismantle the prosecution's seemingly strong case. He ruled that some evidence from the searches of Default's home and car would be inadmissible. Most devastatingly, he ruled that Lori Poland would not be placed on the witness stand during the trial. The rationale likely stemmed from concerns about her age and the potential trauma of cross-examination, but the effect was catastrophic for the prosecution. Their star witness, the one who had looked at a photo and said, "He did it," would be silenced in the courtroom. The heart of their case was surgically removed before the trial could even begin. The prosecution appealed these rulings to the Colorado Supreme Court, causing delays that pushed the trial from March 1984 to October 1984. While the higher court eventually restored some of the suppressed evidence, the damage was profound. The case had been gutted. The clear, simple story of a child's identification was now buried under layers of legal wrangling, and the path to conviction, once seeming so straight, had become a treacherous maze. The legal proceedings against Robert Paul Default now entered a phase that felt, to the watching public and the Poland family, like a descent into surreal dysfunction. The overwhelming, emotionally resonant case built on a child's clarity and forensic matches was being systematically deconstructed not on the merits of the evidence, but on the technicalities of its collection and presentation. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney Robert Gallagher Jr., found itself in a defensive crouch, fighting to preserve what was left of their case after Judge Friedman's suppression rulings. The most crippling blow was the inability to have Lori testify. Without her voice in the courtroom, without the jury seeing the very victim point and say, "That one," the narrative became abstract. The horror of the crime risked being reduced to a dry recitation of tire tracks and hair samples, stripped of its human heart and its most powerful testament. The defense's strategy had effectively muted the central character in the story the prosecution needed to tell. This legal hollowing out created a bizarre and agonizing paradox. The state possessed what seemed, on paper, to be an ironclad case. A miraculously living victim who had identified her attacker with crystal crime clarity, a vehicle matching multiple witness accounts found at the suspect's home, forensic evidence linking the victim to that vehicle, entire evidence linking the vehicle to the crime scene. Yet, in the courtroom, the case was transforming into something fragile and uncertain. The rules of evidence, designed to ensure fair trials, were being leveraged to create a scenario where the most damning truths might never reach the jury's ears. Prosecutors were forced to contemplate a grim reality. They could know with moral certainty that Default was guilty, but the pared-down, sanitized version of the case they were permitted to present might not meet the high standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt in the eyes of 12 jurors. The system's safeguards, meant to protect the innocent, were creating a fortress for the guilty. Compounding this legal unraveling was a parallel personal narrative unfolding for the defendant. While the prosecution scrambled, Default, who had consistently proclaimed his innocence and offered an alibi of being home at the time of the abduction, married his girlfriend shortly before the trial was set to begin. This move was strategically significant, as his new wife now provided a corroborating alibi, buttressing his claim of innocence. It created a classic, he said. They said dynamic for the jury to consider, a domestic tableau of normalcy standing in stark contrast to the monstrous acts of which he was accused. This development injected a seed of alternative explanation into the proceedings, a competing story that, however thin, would give defense attorneys a narrative hook, a loving wife who believed in her husband's innocence, to humanize their client and muddy the waters. By September 1984, with jury selection looming on October 23rd, the prosecution faced a moment of brutal reckoning. District Attorney Gallagher Jr. conducted a cold-eyed assessment of their chances. The suppressed evidence, the barred witness, the fortified defense, and the newly presented alibi had collectively eroded their position. In a later statement that would echo with profound frustration, Gallagher conceded, "The case was weak as some of the evidence had been ruled inadmissible by the judge. I didn't feel we had an excellent chance of winning." Let that statement sink in for a moment. A 3-year-old girl was kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and thrown into a sewage pit to die. She survived, identified her attacker, and her attacker's car and hair evidence were linked to the crime. And yet, the lead prosecutor did not feel confident of a conviction. This admission was not a sign of incompetence, but a testament to how completely the legal process had diverged from the pursuit of tangible justice. The mechanism was working as designed, but the outcome it was producing felt like a profound betrayal. This prosecutorial doubt set the stage for a resolution that would prioritize certainty over justice, a settlement over a verdict. Facing the very real possibility that Thifault could walk away from a trial completely acquitted, an outcome that would be catastrophic for the victim and the public's faith in the system, the district attorney's office entered into plea bargain negotiations with the defense. The calculus was grim but pragmatic. A guaranteed, though reduced, prison sentence was better than the risk of zero punishment. For the defense, the incentive was clear. Their client, despite the pared-down case, was still facing the possibility of a 48-year sentence if somehow convicted on all counts. A plea deal offered a guaranteed, shorter timeline. Both sides, for different reasons, were moving toward a compromise, but that compromise would inevitably feel, to the outside world, like a capitulation. Judge Charles Friedman, the same judge whose rulings had weakened the prosecution's case, now presided over this uneasy resolution. He accepted the plea bargain, but with what he described as a great deal of reluctance. He openly acknowledged the public perception problem, stating, "If I accept the plea bargain, some might consider it a slap on the wrist." He also expressed a twisted concern about the very media coverage the police had once wisely used to find their suspect, worrying that pretrial publicity about Thifault's admitted guilt might now prejudice a potential jury against him if the plea were rejected. The logic was circular and frustrating. The system's earlier failures had forced a plea, and now the publicity about that plea was cited as a reason to accept it. Finally, Judge Friedman pronounced the sentence: 10 years imprisonment for attempted murder and 4 years for sexual assault, to be served concurrently, plus a year of parole. The effective sentence was 10 years in prison, approximately 20% of the maximum 48 years he originally faced. In the sterile language of the courtroom, a case involving the attempted murder of a child had been resolved with a punishment that felt mathematically and morally insufficient. As the judge spoke, Thifault stared ahead, showing no emotion. Behind him, Lori's parents held hands and wept silently throughout the hour-long proceeding, their tears a stark counterpoint to the clinical finality of the law. The sentence of 10 years, pronounced in that quiet evening hearing, did not land in a vacuum. It landed in a community that had followed every twist of the ordeal: the terror of the abduction, the agonizing search, the euphoria of the rescue, and the grim satisfaction of an arrest. For the public, the math was infuriatingly simple. A man admits to trying to murder a 3-year-old by throwing her into a sewage pit, and he is set to serve a single decade. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. Editorial pages across Colorado erupted in condemnation. Talk radio lines lit up with outrage. Citizens wrote furious letters to their legislators and the district attorney's office. The plea deal was perceived not as a prudent legal maneuver, but as a cowardly betrayal, a bureaucratic failure to deliver the justice a brutal crime so clearly demanded. The sense of violation went beyond Lori's family. It felt like a communal promise had been broken. The system, which had seemed so effective in the investigation's first days, had culminated in a resolution that felt shockingly meek. For the Poland family, the emotional calculus was more complex and privately torturous. Publicly, Lori's father, Richard, put on a brave face, telling reporters the plea deal was better than nothing at all. He added a heartbreakingly practical perspective. It spared the family, and especially Lori, from the trauma of a protracted, public trial where every horrific detail would be relived and dissected under cross-examination. In the immediate term, avoiding that spectacle offered a fragile kind of relief, a chance to close the courtroom chapter and try to move forward. But this relief was steeped in the bitter acknowledgement of a justice diminished. The family's attorney, John Litson, voiced the deeper, seething disappointment they likely all felt but could not publicly express. "I think Lori's family is very disappointed that someone could snatch a 3-year-old in front of her house and do what he wants for his own gratification and then throw her in a pit to die." The deal was a transaction, not a vindication. It purchased a guarantee of punishment, but at the cost of its full weight. District Attorney Gallagher, facing the whirlwind of public anger, was forced into a defensive posture. He acknowledged the fury, stating plainly, "People are mad. They don't understand it." In his justification, he returned to the cold pragmatism that had birthed the deal. 10 years is better than nothing. He pointed to the legal costs, which had already ballooned over $350,000, not including immense police overtime and forensic expenses borne by Sheridan taxpayers. His argument framed the plea as a responsible stewardship of resources in the face of a weakened case. But to a public grappling with the moral dimensions of the crime, this sounded like the system balancing its books on the back of a child's suffering. The financial and procedural justifications felt hollow against the visceral image of a predator receiving what seemed like a discounted sentence for a crime of unparalleled cruelty. With the legal drama ostensibly concluded, Robert Paul Thiefault was transferred to the Colorado State Penitentiary in Cannon City to begin serving his sentence. For the Polans and the public, there was a grim assumption that this, at least, was settled. He would serve his time, a disappointingly short time, but time nonetheless, and Lori could grow up with the man who attacked her safely behind bars. This assumption, however, failed to account for the intricate machinery of parole and good time credits embedded within the state's correctional system. Under Colorado law at the time, inmates convicted of crimes between 1979 and 1985 could accumulate credits for good behavior and program participation that could dramatically reduce their actual time served. The 10-year sentence was not a 10-year calendar. It was a starting point for a calculation that would soon reveal the plea bargain's second, more devastating failure. The years passed. Lori Poland grew from a traumatized toddler into a school-aged girl, carrying the invisible weight of her ordeal. Meanwhile, in the prison system, Thiefault quietly accumulated those good time and earned time credits. By 1989, just 6 years into his 10-year sentence, he had shaved his incarceration down to the point of parole eligibility. The bureaucratic reality was staggering. A man convicted of the attempted murder and sexual assault of a 3-year-old was legally eligible for release after serving only 60% of his already reduced sentence. The parole board, facing understandable public pressure, initially denied his release in January 1989. But Thiefault, through his attorneys, fought back. He filed a habeas corpus petition, arguing that the state was unlawfully delaying his release now that he had accrued the requisite credits. The legal battle ascended once more to the Colorado Supreme Court. In May 1990, the Colorado Supreme Court delivered its ruling in Thiefault versus Gunter. The court found in Thiefault's favor. Due to the delay in releasing him after he first became eligible in 1989, and because he had accumulated sufficient credits under the mandatory parole statutes, the law required his unconditional release. Not discretionary parole under supervision, but a full, complete, and unconditional discharge from state custody. The legal language was precise. Its implications were terrifying. The system, having first discounted his sentence, was now compelled to set him free with no strings attached. No probation officer, no mandatory therapy, no registry, no oversight of any kind. In June 1990, he was transferred briefly to a county jail to serve a minor, unrelated sentence for telephone harassment. And then, on December 7, 1990, Robert Paul Thiefault walked out of the Jefferson County Jail a completely free man. Governor Roy Romer tried in vain to block it, but the court order was final. The man who had thrown a child into a pit to die had served 6 years. He emerged into the Colorado winter with no obligations to society and no mechanisms to track his movements. The slap on the wrist had become a full release, and the fears of a community and a family were no longer abstract. They were walking the streets. The image of Robert Paul Thiefault walking free on December 7, 1990, was more than a personal failure for the Poland family. It was a systemic exhale, a moment where the justice machinery concluded its duty and turned away. He left Colorado without restriction, a legal ghost. The unconditional release meant no state agency was tasked with monitoring his whereabouts, his employment, or his behavior. For Lori, now a 10-year-old girl, the news was another layer of betrayal, a quiet, bureaucratic aftershock to the original quake of her abduction. The world had told her he was put away, and now the rules had changed, revealing that put away had an expiration date measured in a handful of years. For the rescuers and investigators who had poured their souls into the case, the release was a profound demoralization. Steve Becker, the volunteer firefighter who had descended into that foul pit, voiced an anguish that resonated with everyone who understood the crime's true nature. "I just don't believe anybody who could do something like that to a little girl is going to change just by being in jail." His words were a prophecy born of grim experience, not hope. The system had operated on a calendar, not on an understanding of pathology. Thiefault did what many released offenders do. He left the state where his notoriety was cemented. He relocated to California, disappearing into the anonymity the West Coast could provide. The Colorado justice system, having washed its hands of him, had no mechanism and no legal requirement to alert California authorities about the specific, violent nature of his past or the conditions of his release. He was just another man with a record starting over. And in that new anonymity, the pattern that experts had feared, that Becker had intuitively predicted, reasserted itself with tragic inevitability. Robert Paul Thiefault sexually abused another child. The details of this California case are frustratingly sparse in public records, shielded by privacy laws and the passage of time, but the central, horrifying fact is indisputable. He was convicted. The man Colorado had released unsupervised, the man who had served a mere 6 years for attempting to murder a 3-year-old, had created another victim. The legal term recidivism feels sterile in this context. This was not a statistical probability. It was a preventable catastrophe. A second childhood was forever altered because the first had been deemed insufficiently worthy of a full measure of justice and subsequent protection. When Lori Poland learned of this California conviction years later, the news fundamentally reshaped her understanding of her own trauma and the system's failure. Her perspective, which had once been necessarily focused on her own survival, expanded with a devastating clarity. The crime was no longer a singular, awful event that happened to her. It was now a chain, with her link being the first in a series that the justice system had the power and the duty to break. That's another child that their lives were changed because of one person and a failure of our system to protect us, she would say, her voice heavy with an emotion that blended grief with fury. This realization carries a unique and corrosive weight, the knowledge that your own victimization was not just a personal tragedy, but a prologue. The system's failure to contain Thiefault after her case became a direct cause of another's suffering. This shifts the burden in a subtle, cruel way, layering a form of communal survivor's guilt atop the personal kind. The California conviction confirmed what the Colorado legal process had repeatedly minimized. Robert Paul Thiefault was a persistent and dangerous predator. The slap on the wrist, sentence, and the mandatory early release were not just inadequate punishments. They were active facilitators of future harm. They were a gamble with a child's safety that the state lost, and an unknown California child paid the price. This outcome raises a harrowing, unanswerable question of accountability. How do you calculate that kind of secondary justice? How do you measure the failure of a system that follows its own procedural map so diligently that it walks a monster to the edge of its jurisdiction and points him toward a fresh start? The cost is incalculable, measured in the silent trauma of another family, another life irrevocably bent by the same man who should have been removed from society for decades. As of recent years, The whereabouts of Robert Paul Thiefault underscore the enduring failure. Now in his mid-60s, he remains on California's sex offender registry, but his listing carries the most troubling designation possible: transient. His last verified addresses in San Pedro and Long Beach are likely years out of date. The term transient on a registry is a bureaucratic black hole. It means no stable housing, no predictable patterns, no way for law enforcement or the community to maintain meaningful oversight. The predator who required the most careful monitoring has slipped into the least monitorable status. The system, which once could not hold him, now cannot even find him. He exists as a spectral entry in a database, a potential threat untethered from any address, a living testament to the long tail of insufficient justice. He is the answer to the question of what happens when a society prioritizes procedural conclusion over protective containment. The ripple from this secondary victimization and Thiefault's vanished status extends back to the very foundations of how Colorado, and eventually America, dealt with sex offenders. The outrage over his release was not just a momentary press cycle, it was a catalyst. Within months of Thiefault walking free in December 1990, the Colorado State Legislature began drafting a response. The result was the Colorado Sex Offender Registration Act, which took effect on July 1, 1991. It established mandatory registration requirements for sex offenders convicted or released after that date, creating a mechanism, however imperfect, for tracking their whereabouts within the community. Lori Poland's case is frequently cited as a direct impetus for this law and is recognized as a contributing factor to the development of the National Sex Offender Registry framework. Her suffering and the system's stark inability to manage her attacker after his short incarceration provided the irrefutable argument for change. The law, in essence, was an institutional admission of the failure her case represented. It was a promise, written into statute, that the next victim's attacker would not simply disappear into the wind. But for Lori, and for that unknown child in California, this reform was a monument built on a grave. It was justice for the future, purchased with the unbearable costs of the past. For Lori Poland, the closing of the courtroom door and the eventual release of her attacker did not mark an end, but a beginning of a different, more private and arduous struggle. The narrative the outside world craved, one of miraculous rescue followed by closure and a return to normalcy, was a fairy tale that bore no resemblance to her internal reality. Her family, determined and resilient, did not flee their home. They tried to piece together a regular childhood from the shattered fragments. But as Lori would later articulate with piercing insight, the trauma was a family heirloom, passed around by people too broken themselves to mend each other. "We were all broken together," she explained, describing a home where love was abundant, but the specific tools for navigating profound psychological injury were not. Her parents processed their own devastating trauma, the terror of loss, the guilt of a moment's absence, but through the lens of their own experience. Lori's trauma, the sensory memory of the pit, the betrayal of the candy, the hands of the man who threw her away, existed in a chamber they could empathize with but never fully enter. The belief that family alone could provide the necessary healing was a kind of emotional tree-off. It stopped the bleeding but couldn't prevent the deep, lasting scar tissue from forming. That scar tissue manifested in ways both visceral and subtle, mapping a geography of trauma that would persist for decades. Certain smells, feces, urine, could trigger immediate, debilitating panic, a direct neural pathway back to the sewage pit. Darkness, or the sensation of being alone and unprotected, could induce anxiety so profound it felt like a physical cage. The months of July and August, the anniversary window of her abduction and rescue, became an annual emotional gauntlet, a season where her subconscious seemed to reenact the dread even when her conscious mind was focused on the present. Perhaps the heaviest burden was one of misplaced responsibility, a survivor's guilt crystallized around a single, innocent choice. "I know I was a baby, and I know that it's not really my fault," she has said. "But I still said yes. I still got in that car." The weight of that yes, the toddler's natural response to a stranger's offer, became a stone she carried, an irrational but emotionally potent belief that her compliance had set the tragedy in motion. This guilt shaped her personality, steering her toward a pattern of caretaking and people-pleasing as a way to earn her place in the world, to prove she would not cause more harm. Becoming a mother herself at age 24 was a seismic event that refractured her carefully managed world in unexpected ways. The overwhelming love for her children was instantly twinned with a terror of failure, the fear that she would be unable to protect them from the kind of evil she had known intimately. It forced her to confront her own vulnerability and powerlessness as a child from a new, agonizing perspective. Intimate relationships, too, were fraught terrain. The wiring of attachment had been violently crossed in childhood. The promise of love and safety had been the bait for a trap. Learning to trust, to be vulnerable without fear of annihilation, became a conscious, daily practice, not a romantic given. This is the true face of long-term trauma, not the dramatic flashbacks of cinema, but the quiet, exhausting work of managing a nervous system that was fundamentally reshaped by terror. It is the work of navigating a world filled with invisible tripwires, of explaining to loved ones why a certain smell or time of year can send you into a spiral, of constantly negotiating between the person you are and the memories you carry. Her path to healing, perhaps inevitably, led her to become a healer herself. Lori pursued higher education with fierce determination, earning a master's degree and becoming a licensed professional counselor and a registered respiratory therapist. She chose to work with the most vulnerable, as a therapist for children and families, at the very Kemp Center where Dr. Krugman had once helped her, at shelters and foundations serving homeless youth and those with eating disorders. The 3-year-old who was thrown away became the adult dedicated to picking up the pieces for others. She established a private practice in Lakewood, Colorado, specializing in attachment, trauma, and family therapy. In a profound act of reclamation, she used the very expertise born of her suffering to guide others through their own. Her professional life became a living dialogue with her past, a way to transform the isolated horror of the pit into a source of connection and understanding for her clients. The act of publicly claiming her story was another critical phase of survival. She began speaking about her experience in 1995, but for years she avoided using her attacker's name, a courtesy that extended from a complicated empathy. That changed after a phone call in 2001 from Thiefalt's brother, pleading with her to stop using their family name publicly. In that conversation, she learned that Thiefalt himself had been severely abused at the age of 3, the same age she was during her abduction. For a moment, she felt a wave of compassion for the cycle of pain. But then she learned the full truth, the California conviction. The knowledge that his pathology had claimed another child shattered any protective hesitation. "I will use his name because he counts on me being silent," she declared. "He counts on his victims being silent." The decision to say Robert Paul Thiefalt aloud was an act of defiance and empowerment. It was a refusal to grant him the shadow of anonymity, to force the reality of the perpetrator into the light alongside the story of the survivor. It marked her transition from a private victim to a public advocate, weaponizing her voice against the silence that allows abuse to fester. This journey of integration, of weaving the traumatic thread into the fabric of her identity without letting it define the whole pattern, culminated in the 2022 publication of her memoir, titled with the haunting words she spoke to her rescuers, "I live here." The writing process was itself a kind of descent and rescue. It was very painful and very lonely, she admitted. It was almost like being alone again in an outhouse and having to face it as an adult, having to get out of that hole. To write the story was to re-inhabit it with an adult's comprehension, to feel the full weight of what had been done to the child. But in titling it "I Live Here," she performed a final act of redefinition. The phrase was no longer a child's desperate claim to a prison. It became an adult's declaration of existence. She lives here, in this world, in this life she built. A life not in spite of the trauma, but one that acknowledges its permanent residence within her while refusing to be confined by it. The memoir was not an exorcism, but an integration. It was the map of where the pain lived, so she could know the terrain of her own soul. The most profound redemption in Lori Poland's story is not found in the courtroom she was barred from, but in the partnerships and platforms she built outside of it. In 2018, a full-circle moment of immense power quietly took shape. Lori reunited with Dr. Richard Krugman, the pediatrician from the Kemp Center who had treated her as a traumatized 3-year-old and later affirmed the rock-solid reliability of her identification. Together, they co-founded the National Foundation to End Child Abuse and Neglect, NCAN. This partnership symbolized a complete reclamation of the narrative. The victim and the expert witness, once allied in a failed legal battle, now joined forces to attack the root of the evil itself. Their mission was audacious, to end child abuse and neglect in their lifetimes. But their approach was revolutionary, seeking to reframe the issue from solely a criminal justice or social work problem into a public health crisis. They argued that abuse is a preventable, treatable epidemic, requiring the same focus on research, early intervention, and systemic policy change as any major disease. NCAN's work, under their guidance, was built on 4 pillars that reflected Lori's hard-won wisdom. The first was research, funding innovative studies and soliciting disruption papers to challenge stale conventional thinking. The second was education and training, equipping professionals across disciplines to recognize and intervene. The third was prevention, creating strategies to stop abuse before it ever occurs. The fourth was advocacy, changing laws and shifting public consciousness. From 2019 onward, the foundation awarded grants, hosted national summits, launched podcasts featuring survivor stories, and organized community walks. It created a national conversation centered not on sensationalized crime, but on solvable health outcomes. While the organization later scaled back its operational size after 2024, its board, including Lori, remained committed to funding research and advocacy. The foundation's very existence is a monument to turning systemic failure into systemic change, a legacy crafted directly from the gaps in the system that failed her. Lori's personal evolution into a thought leader and therapist embodies a philosophy that transcends the desire for personal vengeance. For me, it's not really about justice, she has stated. It's about being impactful. This distinction is crucial. The justice system, in her case, proved itself to be a leaky vessel, incapable of holding the full measure of accountability or providing lasting protection. Rather than wasting her life's energy raging at its inadequacies, she channeled it into building something new, something that could catch what the system let fall. Her daily work, whether in her private therapy practice or on a national speaking stage, is guided by a simple, powerful goal: to prevent people from growing up and causing harm. She targets the cycle itself, aiming to interrupt the transmission of trauma from one generation to the next, understanding that this is where true safety is built. Her advocacy is a form of prevention aimed at potential future victims, but also, compassionately, at potential future perpetrators, breaking the chain before it can form. The cultural impact of her case is seared into the collective memory of Colorado and etched into American law. For those who lived in the state during that August in 1983, the name Lori Poland still evokes a visceral, shared memory, a moment when community innocence vanished. Her case is cited as a direct catalyst for the Colorado Sex Offender Registry and is recognized as a key influence on the development of national registry laws. It occurred in the stark, alert-less landscape before the Amber Alert system, becoming a textbook example of why rapid, coordinated public notification was necessary. The legal reforms her suffering spurred are a form of societal atonement, a belated acknowledgement that the protocols in place were catastrophically insufficient. These changes are her victory, not over Robert Paul Thiefault, but over the conditions that allowed his crime and its aftermath to unfold as they did. They are proof that a survivor's voice, persistent and clear, can bend the arc of policy toward protection. And what of that silence her attacker counted on? Lori's refusal to grant it is her most enduring triumph. She speaks his name, Robert Paul Thiefault, denying him the obscurity predators crave. She tells her full story, with humor, humility, and unvarnished authenticity, dismantling the taboo that surrounds childhood trauma. It's fixable when we can talk about it, she asserts, challenging the cultural instinct to bury pain, knowing it will only resurface in more destructive ways. Her healing, as she openly admits, is lifelong work. I get triggered often. I do my work constantly, she says, rejecting the facile narrative of getting over it. She lives with the reality of the pit every day, but she has chosen to build a life of purpose around that reality, not within its confines. Today, Lori Poland is a wife, a mother of three, a therapist, a board member for victim advocacy funds, and a nationally sought-after speaker. The little girl who told rescuers, "I live here," now lives a life of profound multiplicity. She lives in the quiet moments of therapy sessions, pulling others from their own psychic pits. She lives in the advocacy of Insan's mission. She lives in the courage of every survivor who hears her story and feels less alone. The predators sought to dispose of her in a hole and erase her from the world. Instead, he inadvertently created one of the nation's most compelling and effective advocates for child protection. His attempt to annihilate her amplified her voice to a national scale. The final, resonant truth of this story is that one act of violence never creates a single victim. The ripples spread endlessly to Lori's parents and brother, whose lives were forever bent by grief and guilt, to the rescuers who still carry the image of her in the muck, to the unknown child in California, to that child's family, to an entire community that lost its sense of security. Lori Poland carries the weight of those ripples, not as a burden, but as a compass. Her fight was never for the justice that was denied, a 10-year sentence cut to 6. Her fight is for the future that can still be shaped. It is a fight fueled not by revenge, but by a simple, powerful declaration that no other child should have to live where she was forced to. And in that fight, by choosing impact over vengeance and legacy over silence, she has built a monument of meaning that no courtroom could ever provide. The system failed Lori Poland twice, but Lori Poland never failed to turn that failure into a force for good.